June 4, 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. The utensil in Unoffizier Wilhelm Hoffmann's hand quivered slightly as he tried to grasp the scene before him. On the tray laid a meal that defied every expectation formed during his years with the Afrika Korps. A thick beef stew filled with pieces of meat larger than anything he had seen in months, crisp vegetables that showed no signs of decay, slices of white bread made from real grain rather than fillers, and a glass of chilled milk whose whiteness almost seemed to shine in the hot Texas light filtering through the windows. In a letter that would not reach his mother in devastated, war-torn Hamburg until half a year later, Hoffmann attempted to describe his disbelief. "This cannot be genuine. They must be showing us some sort of staged display. Surely by tomorrow we will be given the same thin turnip broth we knew in Africa." Inside the newly built mess hall, constructed in only 90 days, around 1,850 German prisoners of war sat in similar astonishment. These were men from Rommel's once formidable Afrika Korps, and many had endured months on end with barely 200 grams of coarse, adulterated bread and weak soups dredged with fodder beets. Now they faced serving sizes that, by their recollection, could have sustained an entire Wehrmacht squad for several days. The usual clang of utensils against metal plates receded into silence. Some prisoners quietly wept. Others stared motionless at their food, unable to reconcile what they saw with years of Nazi broadcasts claiming that America was collapsing from shortages and internal decay. What those bewildered soldiers failed to recognize in that moment was that they were encountering the full force of the American agricultural and industrial system, a system capable of producing food on a scale that exceeded domestic needs even while supporting more than 12 million U.S. service members and sending roughly 17 million tons of supplies to allied nations. This abundance, so evident in a single afternoon meal, would initiate a profound shift in the prisoners' understanding of the United States. It would slowly undermine the ideological certainty instilled in them, the belief in American fragility, in German supremacy, and in the supposed inevitability of Nazi victory. To grasp the psychological shock experienced by these POWs, it is necessary to understand the extreme deprivation they had endured. By 1943, the German rationing system inside the Reich had deteriorated into a rigid hierarchy defined largely by scarcity. A typical civilian, if fortunate, received about 1,700 calories per day. Soldiers at the front were theoretically assigned 3,600 calories, yet actual deliveries often amounted to less than half that. In North Africa, where most of these prisoners had served, conditions had grown catastrophic. Feldwebel Vera Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division in Tunisia, kept a small diary that his family later preserved. His final entry before captivity, dated May 11, 1943, recorded the grim state of rations. 150 grams of dark, mostly filler bread, 15 grams of margarine that had turned sour, thin soup flavored with a single potato, and whatever desert plants could be gathered. "The Italians have nothing left at all. We have begun slaughtering our horses." By the time the Afrika Korps capitulated, soldiers who had once been seen as the elite of the German military had wasted away into near skeletal figures. Rommel himself had repeatedly warned Berlin that resupply had become nearly impossible. Ships intended to carry provisions were destroyed by Allied aircraft or submarines, and whatever survived the journey often spoiled in the suffocating desert heat. By early 1943, German medical staff in Africa were confronting illnesses, scurvy, beriberi, severe protein deficiencies that had not been common since the First World War. Oberleutnant Friedrich Bauer, a medical officer taken prisoner at the Kasserine Pass, later described the physical deterioration: bleeding gums caused by vitamin C deficiency, night blindness from lack of vitamin A, affecting nearly a third of the troops, and swollen limbs from protein starvation. "We had become," he observed, "a force of men reduced to shadows." The capitulation of Axis forces in Tunisia on 13 May 1943 placed roughly 275,000 German and Italian troops into Allied hands. Among these prisoners were some of the most seasoned units of the German military, men who had pushed through France, forced British withdrawal across North Africa, and entered captivity with unshakable confidence in both German martial superiority and the supposed weakness of American society. Their assumptions began to unravel almost immediately. At temporary gathering sites in North Africa, U.S. quartermasters issued C rations and K rations, supplies that American soldiers often criticized for their monotony. Yet to the newly captured Germans, these boxed meals felt astonishingly abundant. Corporal Carl Schmidt, taken with the 95th Light Division, later recounted that each ration contained more food than he had seen in months. Dry crackers instead of mold-covered bread, canned meat that was unmistakably real meat, chocolate, sugar packets, and cigarettes. American personnel, almost embarrassed, apologized for not having anything better to offer, an attitude Schmidt found bewildering. The voyage across the Atlantic deepened the shock. The prisoners were transported on Liberty ships, vessels produced so rapidly in U.S. shipyards that many German naval officers would have dismissed such output as fantasy. After delivering materiel to Europe, these ships returned to the United States carrying human cargo rather than sailing empty. In their makeshift troop holds, German soldiers witnessed scenes of casual plenty. Hans Huber, a private from one of the captured units, remembered American sailors throwing out more food after a single meal than his company had eaten during an entire week. Whole loaves of soft white bread, barely touched, went straight into garbage bins. Sailors complained of being served chicken too frequently. One crewman stepped on a slightly melted chocolate bar and left it on the deck. German prisoners scrambled for what was discarded. The dissonance grew even sharper when the ships docked at the Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia during the summer of 1943. As the prisoners came ashore, they encountered a workforce that contradicted every tenet of Nazi ideology. Women and African American laborers performing demanding technical tasks while eating sandwiches loaded with meat and cheese. Workers drank Coca-Cola, tossed half-empty bottles away without hesitation, and smoked through packs of cigarettes, often extinguishing them only halfway. Processing stations delivered yet another surprise. Each prisoner underwent a thorough medical review, during which American doctors issued vitamin supplements to counter the widespread nutritional damage. German military physicians, now prisoners themselves, assisted in treating ailments more commonly associated with starvation than with frontline troops. Major William Patterson of the U.S. Army reported that many arrivals were 30 pounds under their standard weight, suffering from scurvy, pellagra, and beriberi, conditions he had previously only encountered in medical literature. To avoid the dangers of refeeding syndrome, teams placed the prisoners on carefully controlled diets immediately upon arrival. The rail journey from Norfolk to the interior of the country exposed the prisoners to something entirely unfamiliar: the sheer scale of American agricultural output. Over the course of 3 days, as the trains moved through the Shenandoah Valley and farther west, prisoners crowded the windows to watch endless rows of fruit orchards, dense fields of corn, and prosperous dairy farms dotted with well-fed cattle. Small towns displayed grocery stores with overflowing windows, cafes posting daily menus, and ice cream shops busy even during wartime. Ultimately, the United States established a massive internment network that would hold up to 425,000 German prisoners, peaking at 371,683 in May 1945. Spread across 700 camps in 46 states, the system extended from the Pacific Northwest to New England. Texas, benefiting from a climate similar to the region where many captures occurred, housed approximately 50,000 prisoners alone. One early facility, Camp Hearn, constructed in only 4 months, was designed to accommodate 4,800 POWs, becoming one of the primary destinations for Afrika Korps soldiers brought from North Africa. The American prisoner of war facilities offered living conditions far beyond anything most German soldiers had experienced before the war. These camps were equipped with amenities that, to many captives, felt almost unreal. Electric lighting in every barrack, reliable hot water plumbing, proper flush toilets, dedicated recreation buildings, and, most astonishing of all, large dining halls that served 3 freshly cooked meals each day. Records from the camp administration preserved the complete menu for June 5, 1943, the first full day of operations. That day's breakfast was substantial enough to surprise men who had grown used to scarcity. Bowls of oatmeal sweetened with sugar and milk, scrambled eggs, strips of bacon, buttered toast with jam, hot coffee lightened with cream, and glasses of orange juice. Lunch was even more elaborate: vegetable soup, roasted pork covered in gravy, mashed potatoes, carrots, bread with butter, slices of apple pie, and more milk. Dinner consisted of fried chicken, rice, green beans, cornbread, fruit salad, and more coffee. Nutritional analysis shows that a single day of rations in these camps came to roughly 3,500 calories, a quantity that German civilians back home would have needed 2 full days to accumulate. The meat served in just that one menu exceeded what an average person in Germany might receive in an entire month under wartime rationing. Hermann Ritter, formerly a factory laborer in the Ruhr region, later wrote about his first encounter with this abundance. "I kept eating until I felt ill. Then I continued eating anyway. It was the same for everyone. Some men hid extra bread beside their bunks, certain such plenty couldn't last. The guards only laughed and told us the next day would be no different. We didn't believe them." Many historians later concluded that the sheer volume of food available to German POWs undermined Nazi propaganda more effectively than any deliberate Allied messaging ever could. The men had been taught that American society was unstable, inefficient, and nearing collapse. Yet here they were, receiving meals superior to what officers of the Wehrmacht typically enjoyed, while the United States was simultaneously sustaining a global war effort on 2 major fronts. The camp canteens deepened this shock. Prisoners earned around 80 cents a day for labor performed inside or outside the camp, and this modest income granted them access to items that had virtually disappeared from Germany: chocolate, cigarettes, razor blades, soap, toothpaste, writing materials, and almost unbelievable to many, ice cream. At Camp Hearn, roughly 5,000 ice cream bars were sold every week to German prisoners, most of whom had not tasted ice cream since the early years of the war. One POW, Fritz Müller, wrote to his wife in disbelief, "Yesterday I bought ice cream. Ice cream! Even high-ranking party officials in Germany cannot obtain such things anymore, yet here prisoners buy it for 5 cents. The Americans have so much cocoa that they give it to us." Medical treatment in the camps revealed an even greater contrast in resources. The U.S. therapeutic feeding programs for severely malnourished prisoners used vitamin supplements, injections, and tailored diets to treat common deficiency illnesses. Camp hospitals frequently stored more medical supplies than German frontline medical units. Penicillin, impossible for Germany to mass produce, was administered freely to POWs with infections. Dr. Heinrich Schmidt, a captured German medical officer, described the experience bluntly. They handed out bottles filled with vitamins, hundreds of tablets, as if they were sweets. In Germany, we had none for our own wounded. Here, enemy soldiers receive medical care beyond anything ordinary German citizens could expect. By the autumn of 1943, the labor shortage across the United States led to POWs being assigned to agricultural and food processing work. Their exposure to the scale of American production shattered many remaining ideological assumptions. Near Houston, captivated prisoners watched a mechanical cotton picker harvest in minutes what dozens of workers would need a full day to collect manually. At the cotton gin, machinery processed in a single day more raw cotton than many German mills received in a month. But the everyday abundance surrounding American workers impressed the POWs just as deeply. They observed farmhands, including African-American laborers, whom Nazi racial doctrine had labeled inferior, eating midday meals that would have been considered luxurious in Germany. Thick sandwiches filled with pork or beef, whole apples, slices of pie, and steaming coffee mixed with real cream. Some workers discarded food they did not finish. Johann Kellner, assigned to a farm near Jackson, Mississippi, noted in a letter, "The black workers eat meat daily, white bread, fruit. One of them threw away an apple because of a small bruise. In Germany, people would fight over such an apple." At a Del Monte plant on the West Coast, POWs watched trainloads of peaches transformed into canned fruit using industrial processes that did not exist in wartime Germany. The facility processed more fruit in one day than Germany imported in an entire year. Workers drank orange juice casually, and tons of fruit deemed unsuitable for packaging were simply discarded. Nothing astonished the German prisoners more than America's consumption of meat. While German civilians were rationed to 250 grams per week, and soldiers theoretically allotted 150 grams per day, though rarely receiving that amount, prisoners in American custody ate meat 2 or even 3 times daily. Observers often found themselves more astonished by the quality of food supplied to the camps than by the sheer volume of it. Instead of the odd cuts or questionable canned mixtures common in wartime Europe, the prisoners encountered identifiable standard cuts of beef, pork, and chicken, foods that for many of them had disappeared from their diets years earlier. At Camp Shelby in Mississippi, where the population of German prisoners of war eventually reached about 5,300 men, weekly consumption averaged 14,000 pounds of meat. The camp maintained its own butchering facilities, where steaks were sliced, ground beef was prepared on site, and large roasts were handled with an ease that shocked men accustomed to rationing and empty market shelves. One prisoner, the writer Paul Fisher, noted that on a Sunday he received a piece of roast beef as thick as a thumb. American guards dismissed the cut as mediocre, yet Fisher remarked that such meat in Germany would have been associated with a wedding banquet. His children, he added, had never seen beef of that quality at any point during the war. Some POWs were assigned to work at a Swift & Company meatpacking plant in Fort Worth, where they saw the scale of industrialized American food production more clearly than anywhere else. The facility processed roughly 5,000 cattle every day. Employees routinely went home with portions of beef that, according to the prisoners, would have represented a full month's wages for a worker in wartime Germany. Helptman Kurt Zimmerman later wrote that the amount of meat discarded for excessive fat content would have been viewed as a valuable resource in their homeland. One plant, he observed, generated more meat in 1 week than the entire region of Bavaria might see over the course of a year. Before captivity, German civilians and soldiers alike had survived primarily on preserved vegetables, sauerkraut, pickled root crops, and dried legumes. Fresh produce had become a rarity, available mainly to high-ranking party officials. By contrast, American camps received daily shipments of fresh fruits. Many prisoners described the emotional shock of finding oranges served with breakfast. In Texas, during June, prisoners were given tropical fruit that they had not seen in years. The camps routinely stocked apples, grapes, peaches, pears, and even bananas, which had virtually disappeared from the German diet after the early years of the war. Wilhelm Becke wrote that oranges appeared not as an occasional treat, but as a standard offering, and that within a week of consuming them, the vitamin C relieved his long-standing gum problems. According to him, German children during the war would not encounter as much fruit in a full year as the prisoners consumed in a matter of weeks. Vegetables arrived in a similarly broad assortment. The Germans were surprised to receive fresh lettuce, tomatoes, carrots, peas, beans, potatoes, onions, and squash, foods they normally knew only in bottled or preserved form. At Camp Hearn, a 50-acre garden operated by POW labor demonstrated agricultural yields far beyond what many of them believed possible. Prisoners who worked on civilian farms in states such as California witnessed vast orchards stretching out for miles. There, they reacted with disbelief as fruit considered perfectly edible in Germany was discarded for minor blemishes or destroyed deliberately to stabilize market prices. One prisoner, the writer Paul Fisher, noted that on a Sunday he received a piece of roast beef as thick as a thumb. American guards dismissed the cut as mediocre, yet Fisher remarked that such meat in Germany would have been associated with a wedding banquet. His children, he added, had never seen beef of that quality at any point during the war. By 1941, genuine chocolate had almost vanished from German stores and been replaced by ersatz versions made from roasted acorns and beet sugar. Civilian sugar rations had dwindled to 200 grams a month. In the United States, however, chocolate and sweets were available to prisoners on a routine basis. Camp post-exchangers stocked well-known American brands, Hershey, Baby Ruth, Snickers, and Milky Way, names that many former POWs remembered vividly decades later. Prisoner Kurt Wagner wrote that his daily wages were sufficient to purchase several chocolate bars at once, which he described as unimaginable in Germany, where no amount of money could secure a single genuine bar. Camp bakeries produced desserts every day, from pies and cakes to puddings and cookies. Sugar appeared freely in beverages and meals, particularly in coffee and breakfast dishes. Many prisoners, deprived of sugar for years, initially made themselves ill by overeating sweets. Dairy products formed another major contrast with their pre-capture diets. Fresh milk was available at each meal. Butter, cheese, cream, and even ice cream were common. The nutritional improvement from these foods produced noticeable health benefits within a short period. In wartime Germany, milk had been reserved primarily for infants and pregnant women when it existed at all, while butter had become a coveted item on the black market, and cheese had largely receded into memory. At Camp Hearn, the daily arrival of roughly 500 gallons of fresh milk became a small but powerful shock to many German prisoners. Men who had gone years without tasting unprocessed milk approached it almost as a therapeutic substance rather than a beverage. One prisoner from northern France later recalled that a simple glass of cold milk, real, unaltered milk, rather than the powdered or canned substitutes common in wartime Europe, felt like a fleeting return to the peace and security of the world they had known before the war. By contrast, conditions inside Germany had reduced a once valued everyday commodity, coffee, to a memory. By 1943, most coffee available to civilians consisted of roasted grain, acorns, chicory, and other fillers that only reminded people of how far real coffee had receded from daily life. Within American POW camps, however, genuine coffee was served without limitation. For a culture that had built social rituals around coffee, the experience of waking to its aroma, receiving fresh pours at every meal, and adding actual cream and sugar struck many prisoners as an almost unbelievable luxury.
One German prisoner wrote with astonishment that Americans consumed authentic Brazilian coffee continuously throughout the day, while back home, families struggled to stretch a few dozen grams of ersatz grounds as long as possible. Bread, another pillar of the German diet, offered an equally stark contrast. By the late war years, standard bread issued in Germany had become a dense, dark mixture of rye, potato starch, and even cellulose, typically rationed to 2 kilograms a week for laborers. Much of it reached households already stale or spoiled. Yet in American custody, the prisoners encountered soft, freshly baked white bread at every meal, something many had rarely, if ever, eaten during the war. The bakery at Camp Shelby alone produced approximately 10,000 loaves a week, and prisoners could take as many slices as they wished. One POW described the bread as so tender it resembled cake, an almost unimaginable abundance compared with conditions in Germany, where theft of bread could lead to violence or worse. As the prisoners were permitted to write home, their letters inadvertently became conduits for information the German authorities struggled to suppress. Families living on thin soups and ration cards could scarcely imagine that their captured sons or husbands were eating meat multiple times a day. Some POWs concealed the truth, unwilling to add to their family's anguish. Others sent their entire wages home, knowing that their American camp earnings could buy food on the black market that ration coupons could not. One letter intercepted by German censors, written by Karl Hoffmann to his wife, stated that the Americans possessed more food than they could possibly consume, and that he finally understood their motivation to defend what he called a paradise. What many prisoners found even more bewildering than the availability of food was the individualized approach the Americans took in managing diets. Men with chronic illnesses received meals tailored to their needs. Diabetics were given sugar-free options, while prisoners suffering from digestive conditions were served specially prepared bland foods. The degree of personal attention, according to German medical personnel stationed in the camps, surpassed what many German hospitals could offer their own wounded soldiers at that stage of the war. Camp officials even attempted to supply food familiar to German tastes, such as rye flour for darker breads and sauerkraut, in an effort to maintain some cultural continuity for the prisoners. Dr. Wilhelm Braun, a senior German physician assigned to Camp Shelby, observed with disbelief that the U.S. military devoted more effort to meeting the dietary requirements of enemy captives than the Wehrmacht could afford for its frontline troops. As increasing numbers of German prisoners were assigned to agricultural labor across the United States, they unintentionally entered a vast, informal classroom in modern farming. Tasks that seemed routine to Americans introduced these men to techniques far beyond what they had known in Europe. They encountered systematic crop rotation, widespread application of synthetic fertilizers, the extensive use of tractors and harvesters, and irrigation networks on a scale almost inconceivable back home. Many of them found themselves working farms whose output surpassed anything they had witnessed even during Germany's pre-war years of relative stability. One such prisoner, writer Hermann Weber, was stationed on a wheat farm in Kansas. There he observed that one American farmer, equipped with machinery and fuel, could cultivate an enormous tract, 640 acres, work that, in Bavaria, would have required the hands of an entire rural community. He calculated that the combine alone could cut and thresh around 100 acres of wheat in a single day. Weber later recorded his astonishment. The farmer who supervised him produced more grain than Weber's entire home district, relying on equipment and scientific practices that were simply not part of German agricultural life. A different form of cultural shock arrived on November 25, 1943. The prisoners had no understanding of Thanksgiving, but they immediately grasped the meaning of the abundance placed before them. At Camp Hearn, the holiday meal resembled a festival of excess to men accustomed to wartime scarcity. Roasted turkey with dressing, mashed potatoes covered in gravy, sweet potatoes topped with marshmallows, casseroles of green beans, cranberry relish, buttered rolls, and desserts, not one but multiple pies, accompanied by coffee and milk. Each man received more food in a single sitting than a family in Germany might see in an entire week. The turkey portion alone dwarfed the month's meat ration under German regulations. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann noted that the United States appeared to celebrate by feeding enemy soldiers as though they were honored guests, and he wondered whether every American household ate so extravagantly. If so, he concluded, the country resembled a kind of earthly paradise. For prisoners assigned to American food processing plants, the revelations continued. At the Campbell's Soup facility in Camden, New Jersey, they encountered an industrial scale of preservation that Germany could not match even in peacetime. They watched an automated system produce 10 million cans of soup each year, with machinery peeling vegetables, cooking ingredients in continuous vats, sealing cans under vacuum, and routing finished goods down conveyor belts. What stunned them most was the uncompromising quality control. Containers with small dents were rejected without hesitation. Labels printed slightly crooked consigned entire shipments to the waste stream. One officer, Fritz Müller, wrote that the volume of discarded products exceeded the total output of many German factories. To him, the rejection of perfectly edible food for minor imperfections bordered on the surreal. Nothing, however, symbolized American plenty more vividly than ice cream. In Germany, even before the war, ice cream had been an occasional indulgence, reserved for summer and largely limited to towns. By the 1940s, amid shortages in rationing, it was virtually unattainable. In contrast, POW camps in the United States treated ice cream as an ordinary comfort. Camp Shelby, for example, operated a machine capable of producing 50 gallons a day during the summer months. Camp canteens stocked cones, cups, and bars that prisoners could buy for a small portion of their earnings. Writer Hans Mehr confessed that eating chocolate ice cream as a captive felt unreal. Back home, he said even wealthy families would not have seen such a luxury during wartime. American medical personnel tracked the prisoners' physical changes with close attention. Many Germans arrived thin, malnourished, and suffering from vitamin deficiencies. Within roughly 3 months, the majority had gained between 25 and 30 pounds. Symptoms of scurvy disappeared, night blindness resolved, and swelling caused by protein deficiency diminished rapidly. Major Robert Harrison, chief medical officer at Camp Shelby, reported that many arrived looking like survivors of prolonged deprivation, frail, psychologically affected, and visibly underfed. With regular meals and medical oversight, they gradually returned to the appearance of healthy young men. Numerous prisoners remarked that they barely recognized themselves in mirrors as strength, clarity, and stamina returned.
Yet this recovery brought with it a heavy emotional burden. Well-fed and living in relative safety, many struggled with guilt as they imagined their families in Germany enduring rationing, bombing, and hunger. Letters tended to omit mentions of food, partly out of censorship concerns, but mostly out of conscience. A note found after the war from Paul Fisher, never sent, captured this conflict clearly. He admitted that he could not bring himself to tell his wife that he ate meat daily while she went without, or that he lived securely while she experienced nightly air raids. What pained him most was the realization that American captors provided better care for him than the German state provided for its own citizens. The end of 1943 brought another reminder of American generosity. During the Christmas season, church congregations, civic associations, and the Red Cross organized a massive campaign that resulted in 500,000 holiday packages being delivered to German prisoners of war. The contents, ranging from small comforts to basic necessities, reinforced a lesson that many had already begun to understand. Their enemy possessed resources and humanitarian impulses that defied everything Nazi propaganda had taught them. During the war, care packages sent to German prisoners contained an assortment of goods, including sweets, cookies, canned food, tobacco products, and personal hygiene items. Local American communities contributed additional items: handmade crafts, knitted scarves, handwritten greeting cards, and baked treats prepared by church congregations. These gifts were distributed impartially, with no attention given to the rank or political alignment of the recipients. The gesture demonstrated a level of generosity that transcended the ideological divisions of wartime Europe, undermining the foundations of Nazi racial ideology.
Vera Klen Hedman, a former prisoner, recalled the experience. The very people whose sons were fighting against them had sent holiday packages, prayed for them in churches, and had children send festive greetings. She reflected that such acts of charity could only be extended by those confident in their own strength and security. By the beginning of 1944, the abundance of food in American prisoner of war camps had unintentionally become an educational experience. Captives gained knowledge about nutrition, vitamins, the importance of balanced diets, and the fundamentals of food safety. They observed firsthand that proper nourishment enhanced not only physical well-being, but also cognitive function, mood, and overall productivity. Camp libraries were stocked with American agricultural literature and cookbooks. Prisoners studied advanced farming practices, methods of food preservation, and nutritional science. They came to understand that the United States' agricultural success was deliberate and systematic, relying on mechanized farming, scientific innovation, and efficient logistics.
Friedrich Becker, formerly a student of agriculture, remarked on the contrast. The Americans had transformed farming into a scientific enterprise. Soil testing, crop selection, chemical fertilizers, and yield optimization explained the nation's remarkable food surplus. As the war continued, and reports from Germany painted an increasingly grim picture, the disparity between American abundance and German scarcity became strikingly apparent. Letters that slipped through censorship described cities in ruins, civilians subsisting on meager meals like grass soup, and children succumbing to malnutrition. Meanwhile, German prisoners in the United States occasionally expressed dissatisfaction with repetitive camp meals. The stark contrast between their comfortable access to food and the deprivation in their homeland gradually eroded the ideological justification of Nazism. Observing that Americans wasted food and that even non-white workers had diets superior to theirs prompted many prisoners to question the validity of the master race narrative. The summer of 1944 further reinforced these revelations as prisoners participated in peak agricultural activities across the United States. They harvested peaches in Georgia, gathered vegetables in New Jersey, and worked in Kansas wheat fields. The volume of production was astonishing. On a single day in a Georgia orchard, the output from their labor could have sustained an entire German city for weeks. Peaches were meticulously sorted, premium fruit for market, slightly imperfect fruit sent to canneries, and damaged or overripe fruit discarded or fed to livestock. Wilhelm Hofmann reflected on the experience, noting the unimaginable waste of perfectly edible fruit, a scene unthinkable in famine-stricken Germany. An illustrative event at Camp Shelby in July 1944 highlighted the psychological impact of this abundance. Local farmers delivered large quantities of watermelons for a 4th of July celebration. For most German prisoners, watermelons were entirely unfamiliar. The captives were given whole fruits to share, and many did not know how to consume them. The sweetness and sheer availability of the fruit moved several prisoners to tears, underscoring the profound shock of witnessing such plentiful nutrition. German prisoners of war stationed in the United States during World War II were frequently struck by the sheer abundance of American agriculture and food supply, which contrasted starkly with the shortages they had endured in Germany. Unteroffizier Carl Schmidt observed with amazement the massive green fruits bursting with red flesh that could easily feed an entire family. In Germany, such quantities of fresh produce were unimaginable. Yet in the United States, these fruits were casually eaten in part and the remainder often discarded, a wastefulness that Schmidt interpreted as a sign of a nation's immense prosperity.
Work assignments on Iowa cornfields brought further astonishment. The scale of production was beyond German comprehension. A single state produced more corn than Germany's total grain output. What was more surprising was the intended use of this grain. Unlike Germany, where most crops were directed to human consumption, American farmers allocated the bulk of their harvest to feed livestock. Feldwebel Hermann Fischer documented, "Corn is grown mainly for pigs and cattle. They have so much grain that converting it into meat is not only feasible, it is routine." For Germans who had lived under rationing and scarcity, this practice seemed extravagant and almost incomprehensible. At a sugar beet processing facility in Colorado, German POWs witnessed production on a scale previously thought impossible. While civilians in Germany were limited to 200 grams of sugar per month, the Colorado plant processed approximately 5,000 tons of sugar beets each day, generating enormous quantities of refined sugar. Workers were partially compensated with sugar itself, and its liberal use in everyday meals, coffee, cereal, baking, was an everyday practice. Oberreiter Paul Weber recalled his disbelief, noting that a worker might dissolve in a single cup of coffee an amount equivalent to 2 months of sugar rationing for a German citizen. Fishing operations along the Gulf Coast presented yet another illustration of American abundance. German POWs watched fleets returning with enormous catches, often discarding tons of bycatch simply because it did not match the targeted species. At Galveston, prisoners observed shrimpers throw away more fish in one day than German commercial fleets could harvest in an entire week. Writer Hans Müller commented on the cultural shock. "They tossed entire loads of fish back into the water because they weren't the right kind. In Germany, people would struggle over even fish heads." Dairy farms in Wisconsin provided another striking example. Some single farms produced more milk daily than entire districts in Germany. The technology, mechanical milking machines, refrigerated storage tanks, pasteurization equipment, was decades ahead of anything in wartime Germany. Equally remarkable was the casual disposal of milk that did not meet perfect quality standards, the abundant use of cream, and the production of butter in volumes that could supply large German cities. Unteroffizier Fritz Wagner described a single farm producing 1,000 gallons of milk each day, with excess milk being spread onto fields as fertilizer. At a Maryland egg farm, German POWs encountered industrial-scale poultry operations entirely foreign to them. The facility housed around 50,000 chickens, generating 40,000 eggs per day. Automated systems handled collection, washing, and sorting. In Germany, under rationing, a person might receive only 1 egg per week when available. In contrast, American prisoners were served eggs daily, and trainloads of eggs were routinely shipped to urban centers. Writer Wilhelm Becker observed, "Each building contained more birds than our entire village. The number of cracked eggs discarded daily exceeded Germany's total production." Thanksgiving of 1944 further illustrated the contrast. Despite the U.S. fighting on 2 major fronts, the holiday meals provided to German POWs had grown even more lavish than the previous year. The offerings included turkey, ham, roast beef, mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes, stuffing, gravy, green beans, corn, cranberry sauce, multiple types of pies, ice cream, coffee, milk, and wine. For prisoners from a country where children sometimes subsisted on grass soup and cities were in ruins, the abundance was overwhelming. Hedman Vera Mueller reflected, "The Americans have so much food that they can serve their enemies better than we ever fed ourselves in peacetime. Their conquest begins with nourishment long before their armies arrive."
By the latter part of 1944, numerous German prisoners in American camps ceased sending letters home concerning their meals. The act of writing about plentiful food while their families faced deprivation produced intense emotional strain. Post-war discoveries of hidden diaries and unsent correspondence revealed a profound psychological burden. Living in comfort amid loved ones' starvation was agonizing. In one such unsent note, Otto Schmidt conveyed, "I could send you 1 meal from here, and it would sustain your household for days. I dine in abundance, while you endure deprivation." As 1945 began, reports of Germany's failing military and economic situation reached the prisoners, highlighting a stark incongruity. While dining in heated mess halls, they learned of German defeats, including the failure of the Ardennes offensive, and saw images of civilians suffering extreme hunger. American newspapers illustrated German children with distended bellies and symptoms of severe malnutrition. scenes the prisoners recognized as resembling their own families. Hans Fischer, a writer in the camps, commented, "Children in Germany survive on grass soup. Meanwhile, I eat bacon at breakfast. My little Klaus suffers in hunger while I sit with full plates." When Germany officially surrendered on May 8, 1945, the German prisoners confronted an ironic reality. Liberation meant a return to a country devastated by war and on the brink of famine. Paradoxically, many were reluctant to leave the camps, which had come to represent temporary refuge from the scarcity that awaited them at home. In response, the U.S. military initiated programs designed to equip prisoners with skills in food production and preservation to aid in post-war recovery. German prisoners were instructed in techniques such as canning, sustainable farming practices, nutrition education, and organized food distribution. Major General Louis Lurch, responsible for overseeing prisoner operations, emphasized, "These men have observed the level of abundance achievable in America. They will return home with practical knowledge that can help mitigate starvation." In repatriation, approached in late 1945 and early 1946, prisoners faced another form of irony. They had to transition from plentiful diets back to extreme scarcity. Camp authorities gradually reduced rations to help them adjust physically and psychologically to limited food supplies. In addition, they were taught practical survival skills, including foraging, creating nourishing soups from minimal ingredients, and preserving foods without refrigeration. The very camps that had provided abundance now instructed prisoners in subsistence living. Dr. Wilhelm Hofmann, the senior German medical officer in the camps, explained, "We must prepare men to endure hunger again. Their bodies have grown accustomed to surplus. Returning them to standard German rations without preparation could be fatal." Before leaving, camps organized farewell meals that exceeded even traditional holiday feasts. For instance, Camp Shelby's final dinner in February 1946 featured shrimp cocktail, prime rib, lobster tails, baked potatoes with butter and sour cream, asparagus, Caesar salad, chocolate cake, ice cream, wine, and coffee. Prisoners often wept, not from celebration, but in recognition that such abundance would likely never be experienced again. Friedrich Müller reflected, "Our final American meal surpassed anything I had eaten in Germany. The next day, we faced turnip soup and coarse bread. America filled our stomachs and shattered our hearts simultaneously."
The journey back to Germany revealed the full devastation wrought by the war. As trains crossed the border, returning prisoners observed landscapes of ruin and desolation. Skeletal civilians at stations begged for food, while children displayed clear signs of malnutrition. At Frankfurt, prisoners witnessed adults scrambling over discarded military provisions, desperately seeking sustenance. Paul Weber wrote, "We returned to a devastated homeland. My wife could scarcely recognize me. I had become too well fed to belong. My son, born in my absence, suffered rickets from lack of nourishment. The shame and helplessness were overwhelming." Despite the trauma of returning to scarcity, former prisoners played a pivotal role in Germany's recovery. Having experienced American agricultural techniques, nutritional practices, and methods of food preservation firsthand, they possessed knowledge that could catalyze reconstruction. Many took leading roles in modernizing German farming, introducing mechanization, chemical fertilizers, and scientific approaches previously unfamiliar in the country. They had witnessed abundance and thus believed that recovery was achievable. Hans Müller, a former camp writer, later served as an agricultural advisor in Bavaria, noting, "Our time in American fields taught lessons German institutions never did, that rational science and a democratic society can create abundance." When the Marshall Plan was announced in 1947, returning prisoners immediately grasped its potential. They had first-hand experience of American generosity and material resources and understood that such aid was feasible because they had observed the scale of production and waste in the United States. The subsequent flow of food and economic assistance to Germany mirrored the abundance they had encountered in the camps, now extended to the nation as a whole. Wilhelm Schmidt, who had served as a Feldwebel, reflected on his time after capture, noting, "Once more the Americans provided for us now as free individuals. They brought wheat, powdered milk, and canned provisions, the same foods we had consumed during our imprisonment. Research carried out in the 1950s revealed notable differences in the attitudes of German prisoners who had been held in U.S. camps compared with those interned by other Allied forces. Those who experienced American captivity demonstrated a stronger inclination toward democratic ideals, showed greater acceptance of international economic collaboration, and maintained favorable impressions of the United States. Central to this transformation was the experience of food. Having encountered abundance, these men returned to Germany with a desire for similar prosperity. They had observed firsthand that wealth stemmed from productive labor rather than conquest, and that scientific agricultural methods could deliver sustenance and well-being more effectively than claims of racial supremacy. In 1955, Dr. Hans Richter analyzed the experiences of former prisoners of war and concluded that the U.S. camps functioned, albeit unintentionally, as sites of democratic education. By providing ample, consistent nutrition, the camps exposed prisoners to realities their prior ideologies had concealed. A system based on democratic governance and capitalist productivity could generate real material security and comfort in contrast to the promises of fascist rhetoric.
During the 1960s and 1970s, as these former POWs aged, many began documenting their experiences in memoirs and interviews. Across these accounts, food consistently emerged as the most psychologically transformative element of captivity. Werner Hoffmann, who had served with the Hedman unit, later recounted, "Before Eisenhower's troops reached us, we had already been subdued by the meals. Every dish was a testament to their capability. Our surrender to abundance preceded our military capitulation." Similarly, Kurt Mueller, formerly of the UN Raffzia Division, reflected, "Through food, I understood America more fully than any book could have conveyed. The casual profusion revealed surplus. The diversity of choices demonstrated freedom." In the 1980s, a number of former German POWs returned to the United States for reunions. They visited the sites of former camps, now repurposed, and met both former American guards and local civilians who remembered their presence. At a 1985 gathering at Camp Shelby, former POW Hans Verber shared German beer with American veterans, raising a toast. "You nourished us when we were your adversaries. You introduced us to plenty when we had only known shortage. We went home with full bellies and renewed aspirations." American Guard Robert Johnson responded modestly, "We were simply sharing what we ourselves ate. Nothing extraordinary, just the way things are in America. It only seems remarkable to those who have lived with deprivation." The numerical and qualitative differences in rations illustrate the contrast sharply. German civilians in 1943 to 1945 were allocated minimal provisions, roughly 2 kilograms of bread weekly, 250 grams of meat when available, 100 grams of fats, 200 grams of sugar per month, no milk for adults, and a single egg per week if attainable, resulting in daily caloric intake between 1,200 and 1,700. By contrast, POWs in American camps received abundant food, unlimited bread, 350 grams of meat daily, daily fats such as butter, sugar freely in coffee and desserts, a quart of milk each day, and eggs at every breakfast, totaling 3,500 to 4,000 calories per day. The disparity extended beyond quantity. German civilian rations were often composed of low-quality substitutes, spoiled items, or sawdust fillers, whereas American rations were fresh, varied, and even superior in quality to pre-war German standards. Psychological research conducted after the war suggested that exposure to these plentiful meals catalyzed a form of cognitive realignment among former POWs. Regular experiences of nourishment prompted them to reconsider deeply held convictions regarding American society, the notion of German superiority, and the sources of national strength. Dr. Friedrich Braun, in a 1950 study, observed that POWs underwent an involuntary ideological reorientation via ingestion.
In other words, their beliefs were not reshaped through coercion or propaganda, but through the repeated, tangible experience of consumption. Each meal silently contradicted Nazi doctrine, illustrating that the ordinary act of eating could become a vector for profound political and social insight. The transformation experienced by German prisoners of war in the United States was profound precisely because it was grounded in direct experience rather than abstract learning. These men did not simply study the concept of American abundance, they lived it. They did not read about agricultural productivity, they actively participated in harvesting and handling food. Former POWs became inadvertent ambassadors of American food culture when they returned to post-war Germany, bringing with them not only recipes acquired in mess halls, cooking methods taught by local farm families, but also a tangible belief that widespread prosperity was achievable. In the 1950s, the earliest German supermarkets were modeled on the American stores these men had observed, reflecting the lessons learned from their captivity. The very notion of consumer choice, organized aisles, refrigerated sections, and frozen goods originated in part from this exposure to American practices. The eventual acceptance and success of American-style fast food in Germany was also influenced by former POWs who recalled hamburgers, hot dogs, and ice cream, having enjoyed these treats during their time in U.S. camps. They had experienced abundance firsthand and carried that expectation back home.
At a major reunion of German POWs in 1995, marking the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, 89-year-old Otto Müller delivered a keynote address that captured the essence of this transformation. He recounted they had arrived in America as soldiers of the so-called master race, certain of their superiority and of Germany's inevitable victory. They left humbled, having consumed the fruits of a society rooted in generosity. Meals in U.S. camps were more than sustenance. They were daily lessons in democracy and prosperity. Abundance revealed itself not in ideology or armaments, but in wheat, meat, and even ice cream, the latter a luxury unimaginable to German children during the war. Returning to Germany, these men carried knowledge more valuable than military intelligence. They had seen that prosperity could be realized. They had tasted democracy and found it nourishing. They had witnessed both war and peace, and the contrast left them convinced of the superiority of generosity over aggression. Müller's message emphasized that American kindness, expressed through shared food, had conquered ideological foes without violence. Donuts, coffee, cream, and hearty meals became instruments of psychological transformation. This transformation did not occur through orchestrated propaganda or coercion. The experience of more than 425,000 German POWs in American camps, 371,683 at the peak, demonstrates the power of everyday abundance to reshape perception. Soldiers who had fought for the Third Reich returned home no longer as loyal adherents to Nazi ideology, but as witnesses to the practicality and appeal of American prosperity. The camp's provisions undermined extremist beliefs at the most basic level. Every generous serving contradicted the narrative of American weakness. Every dessert challenged wartime propaganda. Every glass of milk symbolized the viability of abundance. Ultimately, the weapons that transformed these men were not military in nature. Atomic bombs, tanks, and bombers achieved geopolitical objectives, but it was the steady supply of nourishing food, apple pie, chocolate, beef, that had an enduring psychological effect. German POWs expected to encounter a weakened and divided America. Instead, they confronted a nation capable of feeding even its adversaries better than Germany could sustain its own citizens. They saw the potential of a society built not on conquest, but on provision. The implications of this experience were lasting. Former POWs returned as advocates for abundance, promoting ideas of economic prosperity, efficiency, and social welfare.
They became early supporters of the Marshall Plan and the Atlantic Alliance, helping to rebuild Germany into a peaceful, productive society. Their first-hand encounters with American abundance demonstrated that national strength was not defined solely by military power, but by the capacity to generate and share wealth and sustenance. In conclusion, the story of German POWs in U.S. camps illustrates a remarkable example of nonviolent influence. It highlights the power of hospitality to reshape minds, the role of generosity in transforming enemies into partners, and the enduring impact of experiencing prosperity directly. These men left America not only fed, but enlightened, carrying with them a vision of what their homeland could become. They had witnessed the tangible benefits of abundance, and in doing so, became unexpected ambassadors for a new Germany, one capable of embracing peace, productivity, and cooperation.